I'm Jake Harrison, just an average office worker in my 30s, grinding away in the daily commute between home and work. The fatigue of aging and the monotony of routine seem inevitable. But what really wears me down is my boss, Mrs. Wilson. She's competent, beautiful, and looks like a model. On top of that, she's an elite who was promoted early due to her outstanding performance. She's so perfect that people often joke God must have packed all the talent into one person when he created her. However, for some reason, she's particularly tough on me. Jake, there was another error in your paperwork, wasn't there? I'm sorry. I'm not looking for an apology. I want to know why you made a mistake. Listen carefully to what people say. Because I often make mistakes, Mrs. Wilson frequently scolds me like this. The pressure to avoid errors adds to my exhaustion. It's always so relaxing here, I say as I take a seat on a bench in a nearby park. The park is close to my office, but it's usually quiet because it's frequented by homeless people. That's why I often take my breaks here. It's my hidden retreat. Well, let's see how much I can get done today. I mutter after quickly finishing my sandwich and pulling some yarn out of my bag. People might think it's feminine, but I've always enjoyed crafting. Knitting here is my way of relieving stress. There's another reason I choose to knit here. Back again today, Jake. Hello, Joe, I reply. When I knit, an old homeless man named Joe often comes to sit next to me. He's a friendly guy and a good conversation partner. People tend to shun him because he's homeless, but Joe doesn't mock me for knitting or call me feminine. He always listens to my stories. We started talking a few months ago, back when I was dumped by my girlfriend, the one I wanted to marry. We had been together for 3 years, but one day she suddenly disappeared, calling me effeminate and disgusting. She moved out and left me, and that made me desperate. Even after 3 years of dating, the way she ended things was unbelievable. I had even knitted a woolen hat for her, but I never got the chance to give it to her. Honestly, I thought about throwing it away, but that's when Joe spoke to me. Are you really going to throw that away? Yeah, but would you like to use it? I plan to give it to my girlfriend, but I don't need it anymore. I must have looked devastated at that time, but Joe listened to me compassionately. That encounter became the start of our friendship, and we began to chat regularly in the park. He still treasures the hat I gave him. Joe's a truly kind person. You seem even more passionate today, Joe observes. Yeah, you know what? I made a mistake again today. During my brief lunch break, talking to this old homeless man is my way of relaxing. Joe listens to my stories with interest, and I enjoy our time together. But fun times always end too quickly. Well, I'll be back. Don't make a mistake next time, I say, packing up my knitting and handing Joe some snacks I brought for him. I leave the park. A few weeks later, I was assigned to go on an outside job with Mrs. Wilson. She's very efficient at her work and very popular with our clients. Honestly, I wonder if I'm really needed, but it seems the reason is that the luggage is heavy. So help me, she says. I can't help it. My sales skills are lacking. Today, I was knitting in the park, hoping she would rely on me a bit more. Hello, Jake. Joe, hello, sorry, I might not be able to stay long today. I have an outside job after lunch. That must be tough, he says in his usual relaxed tone. When I talk to him, the tension leaves my shoulders and I can relax. He may have once had a job where he had to talk to people. As I was thinking that, my phone suddenly rang. It was Mrs. Wilson. Jake, where are you right now? I'm at Cozy Park. That's perfect. I decided to use my car for today's field job, so I'll pick you up. After Mrs. Wilson said that, I checked my watch. Indeed, lunch break was almost over. The timing was perfect. I was called by my boss, so I'll leave soon. Is it the scary boss you were talking about? Joe asks with a grin. Ha, don't say that in front of her. I saw Mrs. Wilson's car stop at the entrance of the park. As I approached her, I apologized. Sorry, Mrs. Wilson, for making you pick me up. It's on the way, so it doesn't matter. I didn't know there was a park here, she said, looking around. But then she froze, staring at Joe behind me. Dad? Mrs. Wilson ran up to Joe and hugged him tightly. I've been looking for you. I was so worried. Jake, who is this beautiful person? Joe asked, looking puzzled. Mrs. Wilson was stunned when I explained that Joe has amnesia. Dad, did you forget about me? Are you sure you're not mistaken? I can't believe I have such a beautiful daughter. You're not mistaken. Those gloves were made by Mom. Mrs. Wilson said, her voice trembling as tears welled up in her eyes. Come to think of it, Joe always wore those ragged gloves, even though they were worn out, with holes and missing fingers. He had cherished them ever since he came here. Mrs. Wilson asked Joe several times about the gloves, but he just tilted his head, unable to recall. Seeing we weren't getting anywhere, I suggested we leave the park for now. It was time for work after all. During the field job, Mrs. Wilson was unusually silent. She's always been strict but professional, never letting personal feelings interfere with work. But as soon as we returned to the parking lot, she broke down, tears streaming down her face as she muttered to herself, "Dad, was it so traumatic that you forgot?" She looked so pitiful that I couldn't just stand by. "Mrs. Wilson, if you're okay with it, I'll listen," I offered, more as a consolation than anything. But it seemed like she really needed someone to talk to. Slowly, she began to open up about Joe. Now about her father, Mr. John Wilson. The Wilson family was a bit wealthier than the average household. Mr. John was a school teacher, and his wife was a nurse. However, when Mrs. Wilson was just starting her career, her mother passed away suddenly in a traffic accident. "Dad loved Mom so much," she explained. "After she passed, he quit his job and secluded himself. I had already moved out of the house, but I would check on him in between work. As my work got busier, I couldn't go home often, and I couldn't reach him by phone. When I finally returned home after a long while, he was gone. I filed a missing persons report, but he couldn't be found. If I had been by his side, this wouldn't have happened." It seemed Mrs. Wilson had been blaming herself for her father's disappearance all this time. Seeing her cry so sorrowfully hurt me too. I wanted to bring Joe home, but he didn't seem to recognize her, and even if we took him home in his current condition, he'd likely just return to the park. There were a lot of hurdles to overcome, including getting him examined at a hospital. "Dad, if we return home, will you remember something?" Mrs. Wilson asked, her voice soft. "Even if he doesn't remember, at least I want to take him to the hospital," she added, her worry as a daughter evident. I thought for a moment and then came up with an idea. "Hey, Mrs. Wilson, let's knit." "Knit?" "Joe, I mean Mr. John, is a really kind person. The reason I first became friends with him is that he spoke to me when he saw me knitting. He also cherished those gloves, so if you give him a gift, he might be interested and listen to you." Joe always seemed to have an interest in knitting. Mrs. Wilson's face brightened slightly. "My mom used to knit a lot. He might vaguely remember that," she said, but then looked down. "But I've never knitted before." "It's okay, I'll teach you," I offered. "Jake, thank you. I'm sorry you have to see me like this," Mrs. Wilson replied, smiling weakly. She seemed worried, but it was clear she wanted to do something for her father. Looking straight at me, she asked, "Could you teach me how to knit again?" "Yes, of course," I said. And so I found myself teaching Mrs. Wilson to knit. There were only a few places where we could practice together, so we decided to knit in the car. Could you take that thread like this?" "Yes, now put it through that loop." "Oh, it's not going in well. Should I push it further in?" "Well, no, don't pull the yarn like that," I instructed, though things weren't going smoothly. I think we had this kind of conversation about 5 times. Mrs. Wilson is incredibly capable at work, but it turns out she's also incredibly clumsy. When the idea of knitting came up, it made sense that she might have hesitated. Honestly, I thought it would take a long time, but Mrs. Wilson surprised me. She practiced at home, and before I knew it, she was getting the hang of it. The stitches were basic and a bit rough, but still she kept at it. After several months, Mrs. Wilson finally finished knitting a scarf. "Let's go deliver it," I suggested. "But what if he doesn't accept it?" she asked, her voice full of doubt. "He's not that kind of person. Come on," I reassured her. I wanted to show Joe the scarf that Mrs. Wilson had worked so hard to make, so I took her hand and led her to the park. I used to come to the park quite often, but this was Mrs. Wilson's first time back since that day. When Joe saw us, he greeted me in his usual calm voice. "Oh, isn't it, Jake? You're not alone today." "Go ahead, Mrs. Wilson," I encouraged her. With a bit of nervousness, Mrs. Wilson looked straight at Joe and offered him the scarf. "Dad, it honestly makes me so sad that you've forgotten me, but I'm so relieved to know you're alive. I won't even ask you to come back home, but I don't want you to catch a cold," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice trembling with emotion. I made this in the same color as the scarf my mom used to wear often. It's not as good as hers, but I'd like you to accept it." With heartfelt sincerity, she extended the scarf toward Joe, smiling softly. Mrs. Wilson's mother had been skilled at knitting, and this time, Mrs. Wilson had crafted a scarf with a design reminiscent of the one her mother often wore when she was alive. It was filled with hope that it might jog his memory. Joe accepted the scarf, a warmth spreading through him as he wrapped it around his neck. "It's warm. I wonder why I feel so warm here," he said, touching his chest as a single tear rolled down his cheek. "Just looking at your smile, I wonder why I'm in tears." I wasn't expecting his memory to miraculously return just because of a scarf, but it seemed to have triggered something. After that, Joe started going to the hospital with Mrs. Wilson. We're not sure if his memory will ever fully return, but the visits are said to promote his health and social recovery. Though he didn't want to be hospitalized, Joe has recently stopped going to the park and has begun to return to the Wilson family home. Perhaps because of these positive changes, Joe has started to occasionally remember his own name, which made both Mrs. Wilson and me very happy. He still wears the scarf every day, alternating it with the one I gave him. "Thank you, Jake. It's all thanks to you," Mrs. Wilson said with genuine gratitude. Life returned to normal, and I resumed my routine of knitting in the park. One day, Mrs. Wilson came and sat next to me. She's well known at the office and stands out in a good way, so I appreciate being able to talk with her in a more relaxed setting like the park. Ever since the knitting incident, she's been much more casual with me, and though we've grown closer, I can't help but feel nervous around her. To me, she's too attractive, and it makes my heart race. I couldn't help but think, what am I doing at my age? I feel so pathetic. "You're the one who put all the effort into knitting, Mrs. Wilson." "I didn't really do much," I said, trying to downplay my role. "Teaching me to knit wasn't a big deal to you, huh?" "Well, she smiled as she watched me stuff my mouth with a sandwich. Through our interactions, I've come to understand that Mrs. Wilson tends to be stern with those she has high expectations about work. She had high expectations of me too, which is why she apologized for being so strict. "So, Jake, would you like to have dinner with me sometime?" "To thank you?" she asked unexpectedly. "Really?" I was taken aback by her suggestion, but before I could say anything, Mrs. Wilson laughed. "Of course, unless you don't want to have dinner with me." "I'll go. I would be honored," I replied quickly, which made her laugh again. "You're honest. Can we exchange contact info?" she asked. "Yes," I said, realizing I didn't even know her contact information. "Call me Sophia," she said with a smile. "Register me as that, Jake Harrison." "What?" I froze for a moment upon hearing my full name, but she simply input my contact information and casually said, "I'll contact you later," before leaving. Sophia. She knew my full name all along. It made me happy, and I couldn't help but grin. I decided to work hard to earn her trust enough for her to call me by my first name. With renewed determination, I started knitting a new scarf, this time woven in shades of blue and white. I hope to finish it before our dinner, and then I plan to tell her how I really felt. "I love you. Will you be my girlfriend?" When I finally gathered the courage to confess my feelings over dinner, she smiled happily and said, "I knew it. You took forever to say it." Had I been such an open book all along? But as long as she got the message, that's all that mattered. We officially became a couple, progressing steadily in our relationship. Eventually, we decided to get married. By the way, we haven't had our wedding ceremony yet. Actually, when I proposed to Sophia after a year of dating, I asked her when we should submit our marriage registration. I was thinking we should do it on a special date, but Sophia had different plans. "You realize I'm over 30, right?" she said. "Yeah, I know. Don't keep a woman waiting forever. I want to get married right away. Otherwise, I'm afraid someone else might snatch you away from me," she added with a cute smile. So we submitted the marriage registration before the ceremony. Now, although Sophia and I are officially married, I still spend time knitting at the same park. "I want to wear a stole you made at our wedding," she said one day. Hearing something like that is incredibly motivating. Plus, Joe is planning to come to the wedding too. He hasn't remembered everything yet, but he's slowly recalling bits and pieces of his past. I thought our wedding might serve as some kind of trigger, but he seemed unsure, asking, "Am I even supposed to be there?" with an anxious look on his face. To ease Joe's worries, I'm planning to gift him something I've needed as well. According to him, the things we've needed have been like good luck charms, providing reassurance and comfort. What color should I choose? Imagining my future bride, I pick up my yarn again today.